There comes a moment when you begin to notice that the things disturbing your peace are not as accidental as they seem. Certain words stay in your head longer than they should. Small situations replay themselves quietly in your mind. Emotions appear instantly before logic even has a chance to speak. You try to act unaffected. You convince yourself it's nothing serious, yet somehow it still reaches you. And maybe the most unsettling part is not the feeling itself, but how easily it enters. How something so small can touch something so deep inside you. That's when you begin questioning what real strength actually means. Not the kind that only looks calm on the surface, but the kind that remains grounded internally. Because holding everything in doesn't solve it. Pretending not to care doesn't solve it either. And reacting emotionally to every situation only pulls you deeper into chaos. At some point, you realize there has to be another way to understand all of this. That's where a deeper awareness begins to form. As one said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That single idea changes the direction of your attention completely. Suddenly, life stops being only about what happens to you and starts becoming about the meaning you give to it. And once you truly see that, even for a second, your perspective begins to shift. You stop chasing stability from other people, from validation, from outcomes you can't fully control. Instead, you begin observing your own mind more carefully, not with judgment, but with awareness. Because true strength is not becoming emotionless. It's becoming conscious enough that emotions no longer control your identity. For a long time, you probably believed your pain came directly from other people. Their behavior, their words, their silence, their absence exactly when you needed them most. Someone disrespects you, and anger appears instantly. Someone leaves, and it feels like they took a piece of you with them. Someone ignores you, and suddenly your value feels uncertain. These reactions happen so naturally that they seem built into the situation itself. But if that were completely true, then every person would respond the exact same way to the exact same experience. And clearly they don't. Some people remain calm in situations that completely destroy others. Some hear harsh words and move on without carrying them for days. That difference is not luck. It reveals something deeper happening internally, something most people never stop long enough to examine. The moment you start noticing this, something inside you begins to change. You realize two people can experience the same event and walk away completely differently. One person replays it endlessly, carrying the weight for days. The other feels it, learns from it, and quietly lets it pass. And maybe that's where freedom actually begins. Not when life finally becomes easier, but when your inner world stops being controlled by every external moment. The other person releases it almost instantly. The situation itself is exactly the same. The only difference is the meaning attached to it. And that's where things start becoming uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea that your emotions are completely controlled by the outside world. It points to something deeper, that what you feel is not only a reaction, but also an interpretation. A story your mind creates so quickly that it feels identical to reality. But meaning is never completely fixed. It's shaped by your past experiences, your fears, your expectations, even the identity you've built around yourself. And once you recognize that, you begin to understand why one moment can deeply wound you, while another person barely notices it at all. This is the point where most people pull away. Because accepting this means letting go of the comfort of blaming everything outside yourself. It's easier to believe the world is responsible for your inner peace or your suffering. That way, the responsibility never has to come inward. But the Stoics viewed life differently. They understood that between an event and your emotional response, there is a space, a silent moment where interpretation takes shape, usually without you even noticing it. And inside that space is where much of suffering is created. Not simply by what happened, but by the meaning attached to it afterward. And that realization can feel deeply uncomfortable, because it forces you to confront your own mental patterns. The habit of taking things personally, the instinct to assume rejection when there may have only been distance or distraction, the quiet craving to feel acknowledged, valued, understood. These patterns didn't appear overnight. They were formed slowly, repeated so many times that they started feeling automatic. But once you begin observing your mind carefully, you notice how quickly it creates conclusions. A slow reply suddenly feels like rejection. A blank expression feels like judgment. A disagreement turns into proof that someone is against you. None of those meanings actually exist inside the event itself, yet they still create real emotional pain. That's the deeper vulnerability most people never notice. It's not only what happens to you, but how rapidly your mind assigns meaning to it. Because the moment meaning is created, emotion follows almost instantly. And by the time you become aware of it, you're already caught inside the reaction. That's why emotional control feels so difficult sometimes. Because you're not reacting to reality alone. You're reacting to the version of reality your mind already shaped. But as your awareness grows, something important begins to change. You start realizing that your first emotional reaction is not the complete truth. It's only the first impulse, the first interpretation. And between that impulse and the response you choose, there is a small space, small but powerful enough to change everything. Inside that space, something important becomes possible. You can begin separating what truly happened from the meaning your mind instantly attached to it. You can pause. You can question the assumption instead of immediately becoming consumed by it. And sometimes that pause alone changes everything. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to loosen the automatic grip certain moments used to have over you. Over time, this starts changing the way you experience life itself. Situations that once felt emotionally heavy become easier to carry. Reactions that used to explode instantly begin to slow down. You still feel emotions deeply, but you're no longer completely controlled by them. And that's where a quieter kind of strength starts to appear. Not the kind that suppresses emotion or pretends nothing hurts, but the kind built through understanding. Because once you realize your experience is shaped by interpretation, you also realize interpretation is not permanent. It can be questioned, refined, seen more clearly. Pain may still exist, but the unnecessary suffering around it begins to fade. The more you practice this awareness, the more stable something inside you becomes. Not because life suddenly gets easier, but because your relationship with life changes. You stop relying on perfect circumstances just to feel at peace. You stop giving every outside situation the power to decide your inner state. And that's when the shift becomes real. You still move through life fully. You still care, still feel, still experience disappointment and uncertainty. But those things no longer pull you apart the way they once did. If this perspective is beginning to resonate with you, don't treat it like another temporary thought that disappears tomorrow. Sit with it, explore it more deeply. And if you want to continue understanding yourself on a deeper level, consider subscribing, not out of routine, but as a conscious decision to become less reactive, more aware, and more grounded in what you can actually control. Because the real transformation begins here. Not by controlling the world around you, but by understanding the mind through which you experience it. Not by escaping difficult moments, but by seeing them without adding layers of fear, assumption, and distortion on top of them. And once those distortions begin to fade, the emotional intensity often fades with them. What remains is something calmer, more balanced, less easily shaken by every passing moment. You begin moving through life differently, not detached from reality, but no longer controlled by every external situation that appears in front of you. Think about how quickly the mind can turn a simple moment into something much bigger than it really is. One comment, a subtle change in someone's tone, a certain look that may not have even meant anything at all. And somehow it stays with you long after the moment has already passed. It stays with you long after the moment is over, into the next hour, the next interaction, sometimes even into the next day. On the surface, it seems like something minor, almost too small to matter. Yet the emotional effect feels far heavier than the moment itself. And that imbalance reveals something important. Because if the situation were truly as insignificant as it appeared, it wouldn't continue echoing inside you the way it does. Something deeper is being touched. Something beneath the surface that has little to do with the present moment alone. Most of the time, this process is almost invisible. It doesn't announce itself clearly. It happens quietly, automatically, shaping your reaction before you even realize it's happening. The emotion feels immediate, reasonable, completely justified. But if you slow down enough to observe it carefully, you begin noticing that the reaction didn't come out of nowhere. It connected itself to something already living inside you, a memory you hadn't consciously thought about in years, an expectation you didn't realize you were carrying, a belief about yourself that has been sitting silently in the background, waiting for something to confirm it. And the moment that trigger appears, it activates everything attached to it. That's when the experience stops being only about reality and becomes deeply tied to interpretation. A simple comment no longer feels like just words. It becomes disrespect. A certain tone no longer feels neutral. It becomes proof of disapproval. A glance no longer feels accidental. It becomes judgment. And once that interpretation settles into place, the emotional reaction follows almost automatically. But what you're reacting to is not always reality itself. Often, you're reacting to the meaning your mind created around it. And meaning is flexible. It's shaped, constructed, and influenced by countless internal patterns. The difficult part is that this happens so fast and so unconsciously that it feels inseparable from the event itself. As you become more aware of this process, you begin understanding why certain situations affect you far more deeply than logic says they should. Not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline, but because the moment is connected to something much larger internally. It becomes part of an emotional structure built over years. A structure formed through past experiences, repeated assumptions, old fears, and interpretations you may have never fully questioned. And as long as that structure stays untouched, every new situation that resembles it, even slightly, will continue triggering the same emotional response. Not because the situation necessarily deserves that reaction, but because your mind recognizes the pattern before you even become aware of it. And most people spend years reacting to patterns without ever realizing they are reacting to the past just as much as the present. This is where most people lose themselves without even realizing it. Not because of the event itself, but because of the meaning they instantly attach to it. They think they're reacting to reality, when often they're reacting to the interpretation their mind created in a split second. And because that interpretation feels so convincing, so immediate, it almost never gets questioned. It becomes a filter, a lens through which every new situation is viewed. Once that lens is in place, the mind starts collecting evidence to support it. Every similar experience strengthens the pattern. The reactions become quicker, more automatic. Eventually, the space between what happened and what you assume it means becomes nearly impossible to notice. And that's how people stay trapped inside cycles they never consciously chose. But breaking that pattern doesn't happen through force. You can't shame yourself out of it. You can't suppress every emotion and expect peace to appear. Real change begins with awareness. It begins the moment you recognize that your first interpretation is not always the truth, that there is a difference between the event itself and the conclusion your mind rushed to create. And inside that difference, there is space. Space to pause before reacting, space to reconsider, space to ask yourself whether the meaning you attach to the moment is actually accurate or simply familiar. That space may seem small at first, but it's powerful enough to slowly change the entire pattern. As this awareness grows, your reactions begin slowing down, not perfectly, not overnight, but enough for you to notice them while they're happening instead of only afterward. And the moment you can observe a reaction instead of becoming completely consumed by it, something important shifts. You stop identifying entirely with every emotion that appears. You begin witnessing it instead. That movement from being lost inside the reaction to quietly observing it is where real control starts returning. Not control over life itself, but control over how much power each moment has over your inner state. And from there, you gain the ability to reshape meaning, not by forcing yourself into fake positivity, but by loosening the grip of the automatic interpretation your mind immediately clings to. By allowing yourself to consider that the moment may not be as personal, permanent, or heavy as it first seemed. And often, when the interpretation softens, the emotional intensity softens with it. Not because reality changed, but because your relationship with reality changed. As once said, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. That idea doesn't deny genuine pain. It simply reveals how much suffering is amplified by the stories, assumptions, and fears layered on top of the original experience. And once you start seeing those stories as interpretations instead of absolute truth, you begin reclaiming something that was always available to you, though rarely used consciously. The ability to see differently. And when you learn to see differently, you begin experiencing life differently too. Eventually, this stops being just an interesting concept and becomes a daily practice. Not something you remember only during calm moments, but something you carry into difficult conversations, disappointments, uncertainty, and emotional tension. Because understanding that interpretation shapes experience is one thing. Living with that awareness in real life is where the true transformation begins. That's where understanding becomes practice. This is the point where Stoicism stops being just a philosophy you admire and starts becoming something you actively live. It turns into a form of quiet inner discipline, not dependent on perfect circumstances, but built through repetition, through catching yourself in real time, through noticing when your mind starts drifting toward assumption, exaggeration, or emotional distortion, and gently bringing your attention back to what is actually happening. Not with force, not with self-criticism, but with intention. And in that small act of awareness, distance begins to form. That distance is where clarity starts emerging. Not a cold detachment that removes emotion entirely, but a deeper clarity that keeps emotion from completely taking control of you. It allows you to see situations with less added meaning, less mental noise, and less emotional weight layered on top. And when you begin seeing things more clearly, the intensity of your reactions often changes naturally. Not because you're trying to suppress what you feel, but because you've stopped unconsciously feeding it. The mind amplifies whatever it repeatedly focuses on, especially when fear, insecurity, or expectation are involved. A single thought becomes a story. A story becomes an emotional reality. But when your attention returns to what is actually present instead of what you fear it might mean, something inside you begins to settle. And this is where responsibility becomes important. Not as blame, but as freedom. Because once you realize your interpretation can be examined, questioned, and adjusted, you stop feeling completely powerless in the face of external events. You begin understanding that while you cannot control everything that happens around you, you can influence how deeply those things penetrate your inner world. And that influence doesn't come from force or denial. It comes from clarity, from learning to see situations as they are instead of immediately becoming consumed by how they feel. The difficult part is that clarity is not always comfortable. Sometimes it asks you to let go of interpretations that feel familiar, even when they aren't true. It asks you to step outside patterns of thinking you've repeated for years. And at first, that can feel unsettling, because without those automatic interpretations, there's a moment where you no longer instantly know what something means or how you're supposed to react to it. But that moment is not weakness, it's space. A space where you are no longer trapped inside automatic patterns. A space where a different response becomes possible. Most people never stay in that space long enough to notice it. They rush from event to reaction almost instantly, filling the silence with assumptions, judgments, and conclusions that feel certain simply because they are familiar. And in doing so, they keep repeating the same suffering. Because certainty, even painful certainty, can feel safer than uncertainty. Uncertainty requires patience. It requires the willingness to pause before assigning meaning to everything you experience. But when you begin staying in that pause, even for a few seconds, something slowly changes inside you. You realize that not every thought deserves immediate belief. Not every emotion deserves immediate action. And not every moment means what your mind first tells you it means. You begin noticing how many of your past reactions were shaped more by interpretation than by reality itself. Patterns in your thinking slowly become easier to recognize. Reactions that once felt automatic start revealing themselves before they fully take over. And once a pattern becomes visible, it loses part of its control over you. It doesn't disappear overnight, but it's no longer operating completely in the dark. You can finally see it for what it is. And anything you can clearly see, you can begin working with consciously. Over time, this develops into a kind of inner discipline. Not harsh, not rigid, just consistent. A quiet habit of returning your attention to what is actually happening instead of immediately believing the story your mind creates around it. A habit of questioning your first interpretation, not to reject your feelings, but to understand them more honestly. And through that process, the emotional intensity that once felt overwhelming begins to soften. You don't become numb. You simply stop being pulled away by every emotional current that appears. You still feel things deeply. You still notice disappointment, tension, rejection, uncertainty. But those moments no longer define your entire inner state. They no longer decide your next thought, your next reaction, or your next action without your awareness. And that awareness is where real stability begins forming, because clarity reduces unnecessary suffering. Not by removing difficulty from life, but by removing the mental layers that intensify it. And those layers are often created through assumption, through interpretation, through the habit of assigning meaning before fully understanding what's actually in front of you. So this practice becomes ongoing, not a single realization, but a repeated return to clarity again and again. And every time you return to it, external situations lose a little more of their power over you. Not because the world itself changed, but because your way of seeing it did. Clarity has a way of reducing things to what they truly are. And that's exactly why many people unconsciously avoid it, because clarity removes illusion. And illusion, even when painful, can still feel comforting. It offers certainty. It provides a familiar story to hold on to, even when that story is distorted. Once the mind becomes attached to that story, it starts navigating life through it instead of questioning whether it's actually true. And most of the time, this attachment is subtle. It doesn't always appear as obvious insecurity or a desperate need for validation. Sometimes it shows up in quieter ways, like needing situations to unfold a certain way before you can feel at peace, expecting people to respond according to your internal expectations, feeling unsettled the moment reality moves differently than you hoped it would. And without realizing it, your peace becomes dependent on conditions outside of you. There's often an unspoken expectation beneath all of this. The belief that life should unfold according to your preferences, that people should respond the way you hope they will, that situations should align with your emotional needs. And when they don't, something inside you tightens. At first it may seem small, just a little tension, a subtle frustration, but slowly your attention gets pulled outward toward things you cannot fully control, instead of inward toward what you can actually understand. Over time, this pattern becomes so familiar that it feels normal. You begin unconsciously tying your inner state to external conditions. A positive interaction lifts your mood. A cold response lowers it. Attention makes you feel secure. Silence creates uncertainty. And little by little, your sense of stability starts depending on circumstances outside your influence. This is where vulnerability quietly begins. Not because difficult things happen, but because your sense of balance becomes dependent on them. The Stoics approached this very differently. They were not trying to erase emotion or become emotionally lifeless. They weren't chasing numbness or detachment from reality. What they questioned was dependency. They understood that the moment your peace depends entirely on external conditions, you become emotionally exposed to those conditions at all times. Because the external world is unstable by nature. People change their minds. Situations shift unexpectedly. Outcomes rarely stay predictable for long. And if your inner state rises and falls with every one of those changes, then stability becomes impossible to maintain. That's why Stoic philosophy places so much importance on returning your attention to what is actually within your control. Not only as an idea, but as a daily practice. A way of grounding yourself in something more steady, something that doesn't constantly fluctuate based on how others behave or how circumstances unfold. And this doesn't mean ignoring life or pretending nothing affects you. It means understanding the difference between experiencing something and becoming emotionally controlled by it. You can feel disappointment without letting it define your entire identity. You can experience uncertainty without losing your inner balance. You can acknowledge pain without building your entire perspective around it. But this process requires honesty, because it asks you to look carefully at the ways you depend on things outside yourself, even when that dependence feels completely reasonable. It asks you to notice how often your mood, confidence, and sense of self shift according to external reactions, outcomes, or approval. And at first, seeing this clearly can feel uncomfortable. Not because it means something is wrong with you, but because it reveals how much of your emotional stability may have been placed in the hands of things you were never truly able to control. But once you begin recognizing that pattern, the dynamic slowly starts changing. You realize that much of the instability you've been feeling is not coming only from the world around you, but from the unconscious dependence you develop toward it. You stop being completely consumed by every emotion that appears. And that difference matters far more than most people realize, because being consumed by a feeling means the emotion takes control of your entire perspective in that moment. It shapes your thoughts, distorts your perception, and quietly influences the way you see yourself. It pulls you into a story that feels undeniably true, even when it may not be. But when you're no longer fully carried away by it, the emotion still exists. You still feel it. You still notice the tension, the disappointment, the hurt. The difference is that you're no longer drowning inside it. Part of you remains aware while it's happening, and that awareness creates distance. That distance changes everything, because once there is space between you and the reaction, there is also space between the event itself and the meaning you immediately attach to it. And this is where many people struggle without realizing it. They merge the two together instantly. Something painful happens, and immediately it becomes a statement about who they are. Rejection turns into proof of unworthiness. Criticism becomes evidence that they are flawed. Failure becomes confirmation that something is missing inside them. But those meanings were not contained within the event itself. They were added afterward. And once those meanings are attached, they begin shaping everything that follows. The emotion grows heavier. The experience becomes harder to process, not necessarily because of what happened, but because of what your mind decided it meant. An unchecked meaning has a tendency to expand. It reaches beyond the original moment and connects itself to old memories, past fears, insecurities, and beliefs that were already waiting beneath the surface. Before long, you're no longer reacting to one situation. You're reacting to an entire emotional pattern built over years. This is why clarity becomes so important. Not in a cold or overly analytical way, but in a grounded, honest way of seeing things as they are. Real clarity means recognizing the difference between the event itself and the story your mind built around it. It means noticing when interpretation has been added onto reality. And that awareness alone changes your relationship with the emotion. It doesn't erase pain. It doesn't make difficult moments disappear, but it stops the feeling from becoming your entire identity in that moment. That's what allows someone to experience rejection without deciding they are worthless, to hear criticism without turning it into self-hatred, to lose something meaningful without completely losing themselves in the process. And that kind of stability is not emotional numbness. It's emotional awareness strengthened by clarity. These are not abstract ideas. They are practical shifts in perception that change the way you move through life in real time. As this way of seeing becomes more natural, you begin to notice something important. A large part of what you once called suffering was never purely the situation itself. It was the meaning layered on top of it, the interpretation, the internal conclusion formed almost instantly. And that realization doesn't erase your past experiences. It reframes them. It helps you see where the intensity actually came from, where the weight was added, where a simple moment turned into something far heavier inside your mind than it needed to be. This is not about blaming yourself for how you felt. It's about understanding how the process worked in the first place. Because once you understand the process, you're no longer completely controlled by it. You begin to see it as it unfolds. You notice when meaning is being assigned too quickly, too strongly, too definitively. You catch the moment the mind tries to turn uncertainty into a fixed conclusion. And in that small recognition, a different kind of choice appears. It doesn't always feel dramatic. Most of the time it's quiet, almost invisible. A pause before reacting, a hesitation before accepting the first story your mind offers. A moment where you allow the feeling to exist without immediately turning it into an identity statement about yourself. Those moments may look insignificant, but they build on each other. They slowly form a different pattern of response, and that pattern creates a different kind of stability. Not a stability that depends on everything going right, but one that remains present even when things don't. because your sense of self is no longer constantly being rebuilt or destroyed by external outcomes. It becomes less reactive to every interaction, every silence, every change in direction. Instead, it is grounded in something quieter and more steady. Your ability to observe without immediately collapsing into interpretation. This is where the idea becomes clearer in practice. Strength is not the absence of vulnerability, it is the awareness of it. It is the ability to notice what is happening inside you without immediately becoming it. To let experience pass through awareness without turning every moment into a definition of who you are. And in that space, something subtle begins to change. Not the world around you, but the way you remain within it.